Everybody knows the story of David and Goliath, right? It's the ultimate underdog story. But what if the story we all think we know is just the beginning? What if, hidden inside this ancient tale, there are clues to a reality that's way more complex and, honestly, way more fascinating? Well, today, we're going to dive in and see if we can separate the history from the legend.
You can picture the scene, the Valley of Elah. Two armies are locked in a standoff, the Israelites and the Philistines. And then this champion, a giant of a man named Goliath, comes out and taunts the Israelites. A young shepherd boy named David, armed with nothing but a sling and a few stones, steps up to the challenge. We all know how it ends. Or do we?
So here's our game plan. We'll start with that classic story we all know. Then, we're going to do some detective work, unraveling the ancient texts and digging for clues in the ground. We'll even look into a wild case of mistaken identity. After all that, we'll explore why this story mattered so much and figure out where that line between history and legend really is.
Okay, so first, the traditional tale. It comes straight out of the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17, and it paints one heck of a picture. You've got Goliath, this huge Philistine warrior, daring anyone from the Israelite army to fight him. Meanwhile, King Saul and all his best soldiers are just shaken in their boots. And then David, this kid shepherd, shows up, says his faith is all the armor he needs, and volunteers to take the giant down.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Think of ancient texts like a historical crime scene. If you look closely, you start to find clues, fingerprints, and contradictions. And believe me, the story of David and Goliath is absolutely packed with them.
So, the very first puzzle we need to solve is about the giant himself. Just how giant was Goliath really? Well, the answer completely depends on which ancient manuscript you happen to be reading.
If you look at the standard Hebrew Bible, the version most people know, which is called the Masoretic text, well, it says Goliath was an unbelievable 9 feet 9 inches tall. To put that in perspective, that's like Shaquille O'Neal standing on another person's shoulders, a literal giant.
But when we look at older texts, like the Greek translation called the Septuagint, and even some pieces found with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they tell a totally different story. They put his height at around 6 feet 9 inches. Now, that's still a massive dude for that time period, no question, but it's human-sized, not something out of a fairy tale.
So, why the huge difference? Well, it's all about timing. The Septuagint is based on much earlier Hebrew texts. A lot of scholars think that over the centuries, as the story was retold, Goliath just grew. It makes David's victory sound that much more amazing, doesn't it? And his height isn't the only thing that's a bit fuzzy. The different versions of the story can't even agree on some major plot points. Like in one version, King Saul has no clue who David is. But in the chapter right before, David was hired to be his personal musician. And then there's the biggest contradiction of them all. Who actually killed Goliath? Yeah. Let's put a pin in that one. We're coming back to it.
All right, let's step away from the ancient scrolls for a second and pick up a shovel. What happens when we start digging? Can archaeology tell us anything about this story?
First things first, archaeology confirms that the Philistines were 100% real. They weren't just some generic bad guys. They were a distinct culture, probably from the Greek world, who were famous for their advanced ironworking skills. That tech gave them a serious military advantage, and it sets a very real stage for this conflict.
And get this part is so cool. Archaeologists digging in Gath, which the Bible says was Goliath's hometown, found pieces of pottery from the right time period, and inscribed on them were names that have the same linguistic root as Goliath. Now that doesn't prove our Goliath was a real person, but it proves his name was real. It was a real Philistine name used in that exact place at that exact time.
So what about David? Well, for a long, long time, there was zero proof he existed outside of the Bible. And then, archaeologists found something called the Tel Dan stele. It's this stone slab carved way back in the 9th century BCE, and it clearly mentions the House of David. Bam! Just like that, we had the first concrete historical proof of King David and his dynasty. So the main players in our story, they have real roots in history.
Okay, so we've got real people and real places. But remember that pin I asked you to hold on to? It's time to talk about the biggest twist in this entire story. A twist that might just challenge everything we thought we knew about our hero.
Here it is, the verse everyone knows by heart. 1 Samuel 17:50. Says it right there, clear as day. David struck the Philistine and killed him. Seems pretty open and shut, right? Case closed.
Well, not so fast.
Because what if I told you that the Bible itself seems to disagree with this verse? Yeah, just a few books later, we find a completely different version of who killed Goliath.
And there you have it. In 2 Samuel chapter 21, it says a man named Elhanan, who was also from Bethlehem, by the way, killed Goliath. And check out that detail. The shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. That is the exact same unique description used for Goliath's spear in the David story. The odds are they're talking about the same legendary giant. So, what on earth is going on here? The scholarly consensus is that the story about Elhanan is probably the older, more original one. Then, over time, as David became this larger-than-life figure, Israel's greatest king, this incredible story of heroism got attached to him to make his legend even bigger. Think of it less as a lie and more like a legendary promotion.
All of this brings us to a much bigger question. If the story isn't just a straightforward historical report, then why was it told in the first place? What was its real purpose?
You see, this story was doing some serious heavy lifting. It wasn't just about a fight. It was about sending a message. Theologically, it taught that faith in God is way more powerful than any army or giant. Politically, it was a fantastic piece of propaganda to justify David taking the throne from a cowardly King Saul. And symbolically, it's the ultimate showdown. David representing courage and divine favor against Goliath, who stands for arrogant brute force.
So, after digging through the texts, looking at the archaeology, and understanding the story's purpose, what's the final verdict? Where does the real history end and the powerful legend begin?
Well, we can see how it probably happened, step by step. First, you have a historical core. There really were conflicts between the Israelites and Philistines, and there really was a King David. Second, a heroic deed. Some warrior, maybe Elhanan, wins an amazing victory. Third, over centuries of being told and retold around campfires, that story gets polished and shaped, and eventually the victory gets handed to the biggest hero of all, David. And finally, the story is written down to teach those powerful lessons we just talked about.
So you see, just asking whether the story is true or false completely misses the point. It's this incredible tapestry woven together from threads of real historical memory, amazing literary artistry, and deeply held belief.
And that really leaves us with one final thought to chew on. What if the real power of a story like David and Goliath isn't about proving every single detail? What if its power lies in the deeper truths it keeps telling us about courage, about faith, and about where true strength comes from? Truths that still hit home thousands of years later.